Hey everyone, so we're going to talk about basic rack programming today, and this is probably the most important topic. Racks are basically the fundamental unit of thought in Ableton. So, you can think about devices as a little piece of thought, but maybe a rack is like a whole sentence, right? And so you really want to learn to use these things. It's basically groups of instruments and devices, right? And we'll talk a little bit about all the fundamental components that are included in them. So the reason these are so important is because you're basically grouping together different devices and you're managing the signal flow either in serial, what happens, or splitting the signal into two parallel chains, right? And like two parallel paths that might eventually like recombine, right? And so you are managing these, and then you can also control all the different parameters of the devices and the instruments that are in these chains and control them from a centralized location called macros, right? Those are these knobs down here at the beginning of racks. And so by carefully calibrating these macros and assigning them to just the right parameters, right, managing the signal flow between these different chains and combining like this amount of the first chain, this amount of that second chain, right, you can create very powerful instruments or really powerful audio effects or do really cool things with MIDI and a million other things, and just generally make really powerful tools that will speed up your production, have you do things that you might not think to do normally because it might take too long, but now you can just do it with a twist of a knob, right? And so just have access to a lot more functionality more smoothly with less headache, right? And really make Ableton your own. And so building racks to serve functions that you do frequently or to enhance how powerful you can produce, and saving those racks as you evolve as a producer is really your fast track to becoming really effective with the time that you spend producing. And ultimately, if you're only going to work on a song for 20 to 40 hours, maybe 50 hours at most, it really comes down to how much you can accomplish in those 50 hours before it's just you can't continue working on a song, right? And if you're going to try and produce as much good art as you can, then you want to produce as much as you can per second that you're actually working on it. So what a rack is it's a group of devices, and it is managing signal flow from device to device to device. And there's two ways that you can do that. You can do that in series, right? So in this case, this would flow into this, right, which will flow into this. But it also manages it in parallel. And so if you look at inside this rack, you'll notice that there are multiple chains, right? And what a chain is, if you think about a real life chain, is just a bunch of links, and the links go in series from one after another, right? But you could have two chains running in parallel, right? And then you would have one after another, but they're both doing that, and they're not combining until the very end. So that's what would happen here, is these two chains would be running in parallel, and you would have this one, this chord device will split the MIDI note coming into it into multiple MIDI notes. This is an arpeggiator, which is going to repeat these notes at a rate of twelfths. So you're managing the signal flow by creating these chains, and ultimately it's by selecting through these chains that you can sort of combine them in an intelligent way, right? So right now I've put on this macro knob, I have put this chain selector bar, right? And I could unmap that and I could just drag this directly, but we'll go into more depth in macro mapping in the second half of this video, but right now I have this controlling this bar. This is what's called a MIDI effect rack, right? This is one of three types of racks that Ableton has if you don't include the drum rack. I'm going to do a whole separate video on the drum rack because it's such a powerful instrument and it's got a lot of ins and outs. So mostly we're going to focus on MIDI effects racks, instrument racks, and audio effects racks today. So let's start with the MIDI effect rack. The MIDI effect rack will take incoming MIDI. If you haven't yet, this is a beginner video, so if you haven't really gotten the distinction between MIDI and audio, that's very important. Audio is the actual sound. MIDI is just data that's saying, hey, a note is on, a note is off, right? It's a C sharp or it's a D, right? It contains that kind of data, but until a note hits an instrument, it doesn't turn into sound. So a MIDI effect rack takes place before you ever reach the instrument. In this case, our instrument is operator, and before we ever get that, we can manipulate the MIDI that happens. So if I play in a C, and I'm going to do this on my computer keyboard because I have this toggle, but if I play a C, what's happening is first it hits this arpeggiator, and we're going through this whole signal chain, right? So we can think about this whole signal chain as just one chain, and we have splits in this chain along the way, right? So first link in the chain is this arpeggiator device, and this is going to repeat every half bar, right? And it's going to come into this rack, and then based off of where this chain selector is, it's going to choose which chain it sends the MIDI note to. Now, what you'll notice is this blue line is dipping down as this second blue line is getting thicker, and we can control how that behaves. But if we grab this top little line, right, we can pull it in from the sides, etc. And so in the case of MIDI racks only, what this blue line is going to represent is it's going to modify the velocity coming into this chain. So if you notice, the reason it's beeping so quickly is actually because of this arpeggiator. We are 100% in this first chain, and then we'll just call this ARP, right? I hit Control R to rename this chain to keep track of it. But we are hitting this arpeggiator, right? And it is repeating at a rate of 1/12. Right? We could speed that up. Slow it down, etc. So watch what happens. On this other one, this is just going to play a chord. So if I were to move the chain selector all the way to the right, we're just going to get a chord. And let me pull this volume down. Right, and the reason it's ticking there is because this is repeating every half note, right? So that's how fast our chords are coming at us, right? And now, at 1/2. So when we morph between these two chains, what's going to happen is it's going to rescale the velocity, and so either and it's only going to update every 1/2, right? So you'll hear that right now. Right, so the chords are obviously getting louder on the right. And these arpeggiated beeps are getting louder on the left, right? So these blue lines are scaling velocity, right? And so that's the idea of this chain selector. You can also select through with actual velocity, right? And so if I played a soft note, for instance, it would go to, right, let's just imagine for a second so we don't overcomplicate this. But we could have this so it would go to both chains with equal velocity. But in this case, it's going to listen to the velocity. And so if I tap some notes right now, we're at 127 velocity. Right? If I decrease the velocity some, it will start beeping. Hopefully you can hear that. Right? So we can select by velocity, and the other thing that we can do is we can select by pitch, right? So the MIDI notes. So in this case, I've been playing C3 this whole time. All right, let me turn up the velocity so we can hear it. So in this case, it wouldn't play anything because the velocity is too low for it to hit this chain, and then it's not playing the right notes to play this. So just to correct this, right, if we play A, C, right, it's going to play on this ARP chain because this is what's below the note that's being played. Right, if we go up an octave, this C is below or above this chord, and so we'll get the chord instead of the arpeggiated beep. So hopefully that's clear. There's a couple things that we've covered here is what MIDI effects racks are, and it's very important to note that all these chain selections, they happen based off of MIDI parameters, which is the pitch of the MIDI note, the velocity of the MIDI note, or in this case, this chain selector, what it's actually going to do is do whatever is below this line, but when we scale it like this, it's going to scale the velocity. So it's a very, very important thing to understand about MIDI racks. It's a group of MIDI effects, right, and we're selecting through it in different ways. Now, next we're going to talk about instrument racks, and they're very similar to MIDI effects racks, but the difference is mainly going to come in a couple places. So let's take a look. So with one operator, this is not a rack, but if we hit Control G or Command G on Mac, this will turn into a group of instruments, which is what an instrument rack is. And you can see right here, it says instrument rack. So this is our first operator, and I'm going to duplicate this by hitting Control D. This is going to be operator 2. We're going to change this so it sounds different, right? We're going to put it down an octave, and we're going to add in some of this, and you'll hear it. If we solo this, so we've got these two tones that we are playing, and if we play a MIDI note, it'll play both of them. Now the reason it's playing both of them evenly is if you notice this chain selector, it's over both of them equally. There's no crossfading, but we could crossfade these if we did it like this. Right, pull this over to the right and take this top guy, pull it left, right, and so now you can clearly hear it crossfading from one to the other, right, just by moving this blue line. We could do the same thing with velocity, right? We could have it crossfade between these sounds when we play at different velocities, or we could do it where different pitches play different note or sounds, right? So let's again fix this crossfader or this crossfaded sample so it's not deceiving us on what's actually going on. But now you can see that as we play different notes, it'll play different instruments, right? So if you've seen my videos on 128s, this is how most of the 128s are constructed. There's actually many, many chains, and then all of these chains together are distributed across the range, and then if you have 128 of these, each of these would get exactly one note, right? And then every note would play a different sample. And so I really encourage you to watch those videos. It's an extremely powerful technique. After this video, hopefully you will have the tools you need to be able to deconstruct how those things work, but it would give you an idea of the type of powerful tools and instruments that you can build with rack programming. You know, we can select through these racks in the same ways with a chain selector, velocity selector, and key selector. I will say that it works slightly differently because whereas the MIDI effect rack would scale the velocity that's coming out of the MIDI effect rack, this is actually going to scale the gain based off of, you know, how these blue curves are set up. Right, so the velocity that's coming in and hitting these operators is actually the same, but it's going to change, you know, effectively change the gain. The third type of rack is audio effects racks, and if you go here, now mine will be a little bit different, and the reason is I switched out the default rack, which you can do by right-clicking on this, and you can save whatever rack you've built as the default. And so when you drag it in, you'll get the default rack, and mine is what's called a dry wet rack. Now you'll notice if we look at the chain selector here, there's no velocity selector and there's no key selector, and that's because you only have audio coming here. You don't have MIDI notes coming to it first like you do with a MIDI effects rack and an instrument rack, right? You have the MIDI coming into the MIDI effects rack, or you have the MIDI coming into the instrument before it ever hits the instrument, right? Here you have sound coming in, so you can really only select through this chain selector. So we'll move the discussion on to macros now, but I just want to see what's going on here is by putting effects in this wet side and putting nothing in this dry side, we can make a dry wet knob out of anything, right? So let's give an example really quick. Say I want to make a lo-fi knob, and then I want to be able to cross-fade in the lo-fi-ness, right? So if I take a Redux and I put it on the wet chain, right, what we can do is we can make this lo-fi, right, like downsample it, turn on the bit reduction, put this down, and then when we're over here, it's going to be a distorted lo-fi sound. Right, let's downsample it even more. Right, so we can then crossfade back in the regular sound and find where we like it best, right? And there's no dry wet knob here, so if you want to be able to crossfade in the dry signal with the wet signal, then you would need to do it this way. So To take this a bit further as we're showing you macro mappings, maybe we want to have a knob that will also control the intensity of the downsampling. So let me show you how to do that really quick. If you right click on a knob, you can tell it to go to a certain macro. In this case, macro 2, which corresponds to this knob. Right, let's do the same thing here. Now what I want you to show you is as we crank this up, both knobs are going to go up. The thing about bit reduction is 16-bit is actually high quality. So we would need to flip the direction of this. So this is where we'll take you into the actual mapping page. If you click this map button, then it will open up this. And you also have one of these for MIDI mappings and key mappings if you hit Control or Command M or K. But on your racks, you have this map button, and this will let you control the macro mappings, which are the macros are these knobs, and it'll control how they control the different parameters. Now you'll notice this knob controls 2 parameters. Now, what these values up here mean, you can drag these and that will change what the value is when it's at its lowest point, when the macro is all the way down, and what the value will be when it's at its highest point. And you can flip these, and that's what we're going to have to do for this bit reduction knob. All right, so if we look at this bit depth knob, if we were to pull this to 16 and this to 1. Actually, why don't we put this at 4? Because we probably don't want to go down below 4-bit, right? So now when we drag this up, it's going to, at its maximum, go to 4-bit. And this downsampling, right, let's control the downsample. Right, this was going to 1 to 1, so that's why it wasn't changing. And so if we put that at 20, then we're downsampling. All right, and so listen to this. If we go all the way wet, we're just going to get the lo-fi signal. All right, this is our lo-fi. Right, and so it's controlling both these parameters at once, right? And so we can find where we like it, and then blend in the dry signal. And so you can see already how this is useful for crafting sound. Now, ultimately, building these tools is just a matter of mapping the right knobs over here to the right knobs over here. And it's not just knobs that you can map, and that's going to bring us to a couple special cases. The first one is on-off buttons, or pretty much anything that will toggle instead of between continuous states or like continuous variable changes, right? Like this goes from 0 or 1 to 20 or whatever it is. If it's just on or off and it's this binary state, right, we can still control that with a knob. So let's map this also to lo-fi. As I turn this lo-fi knob, I want you to watch the color of this on-off button. Right now it's darker, which means it's off. And halfway through turning up this knob, it went brighter, which means it's on. If we open up this mapping, what we will see is that this device on, which is that on-off button, goes from 64 to 127. What this means is the device is going to be on whenever the macro knob is between the values of 64 and 127. And so if we go to 63, you'll find that it's off. And as soon as we go to 64, it turns on. Right? So we can change that. Right? We say we want it so that we'll put this at 1. And the reason we might do that is because when this is cranked all the way down, we want our lo-fi to turn off. Right? We don't want any downsampling, we don't want any bit reduction, nothing. And you'll find that there actually are a decent number of effects that even when you turn them all the way down, they actually are doing something to your sound. And they might be using processing power too. So I actually recommend mapping your on-off knobs to all of your parameter adjustment macros all the time so that when you go all the way down, you can have it turn off just when it's below 1, or you can even put a 0.1 here and then it'll turn off when it's below 0.1. So even if I hit shift up on this, right, you'll see it turn on, even though this is still rounding to 0 because this has gone up to 0.1. All right, so this is all floating point environments. That basically just means you can use lots of decimal places and Ableton will know what they mean. So this would give us the most amount of range while it's on, while also turning off when the knob's all the way to the left. So I've added this reverb to show you the second special case, and that's for when you have a drop-down list with multiple options. Most of those, if you go to, say, Map on Macro 3, you'll notice this quality, and it's going from economic quality or eco quality, which will use the least processing power, all the way up to high quality, which will use the most, but it will sound better. Now, let's just say I don't want this knob to go all the way from eco to high. I want it to be high when it's down, and when I crank it up, I want it to go to medium. Well, if I go into this mapping, you'll notice that there's nothing here. Right? So there's a trick you can use in this case, which is if I group this will be put inside an audio effects rack, and you'll notice that this automatically got mapped to this quality knob. And when I crank this quality knob on the left, right, it'll crank this quality knob on the right, 1 for 1. However, when I do this mapping, this range right now controls how this quality knob is going to move. So let's just say I drop this to 0, or let's say I drop this to 90, right, and I put this at 127. When this is all the way up, this will be at 90, and this will be at mid quality. And when this is all the way down, although this reads 127, right, that will correspond to this being 127, this will be on high quality. So we can gain a certain degree of control over these drop-down lists using that. So those are the two special cases, the on-off knobs, and that includes on-off knobs like this, right? We could map this to macro 4, but you'll notice here we can control when it turns to on and when it turns off. One other trick which most people don't seem to know about these on-off knob macros is that if you switch the range such that the big number comes first and the small number comes second, then it will actually change the behavior. So let's take a look at that really quick. Let's go to 25 or 75 to 25. Now before, it would be on if it was between 75 and 25, but because we've switched the minimum and the maximum, it's actually going to behave the opposite way, in which case it'll be on when we're outside of that range. And so watch, as we go from 0, this will be on because it's outside of the range of 25. Right, if we go to 24, still on. We go to 25, it's turned off, and it will remain off until we surpass 75 on our parameter, right, and then it'll turn back on. So that's really useful. I'll use that sometimes to get effects to work the way I want to. Sometimes I'll have like 5 or 6 different on-off knobs macroed to a certain knob because you want to switch between effects, and you just want a knob that will switch between a bunch of different effects. And you can do creative things in terms of the way the different effects combine. If some of them are mapped to different ranges as others, right? Some might be, on the outsides of the knob, etc. So I want to show you a couple really handy rack examples. The first one is this far away rack. Now, what this does is it makes something sound far away. And to make something sound far away, you need to mimic what happens in real life. And basically what that amounts to is cutting off the lows and cutting off the highs, which you can see happen as I crank up this macro knob, and increasing reverb, which will help cause more reflections. And the sound physics of why this happens is high frequencies are really, really directional, and so a lot of them aren't going to reach you, and they're also the most likely to get absorbed by physical matter because they're low energy and they're small, and so like leaves or whatever it is, that might get in the way if it's playing outside, or a chair, it doesn't really matter. All that's going to absorb high frequencies first. The farther you are away, the more opportunities there are to absorb these high frequencies or for them to miss you because they're pointed in the wrong direction, and so you won't hear them. Low frequencies actually don't get absorbed, and they actually will travel the farthest, but they require so much energy that unless the thing is very, very large, right, those waves aren't going to reach you. And so, but from a distance, if you've got something like a space shuttle taking off or an avalanche or whatever, the high or the low frequencies are all that actually does reach you. So it requires a tremendous amount of force in order to do that. So if you're trying to give a big sense of size, you wouldn't really want to cut off the low frequencies, in which case you would just need to change this macro mapping, right? You look at where the frequency are, and actually I want to show you this. If you change the colors, it will also change the colors here, and so it'll help you sort of find what you're looking to change, right? So in this case, this knob, it's going up to 2,800 hertz, right? If I pull that down, then the low cut isn't going to go up very much, right? So we can just cut off the lowest of the rumble or something as we crank this knob up, right? You can see that now that's barely moving. All right, let's put it back up just so you can hear these sonic examples. So have a listen to this. Right, so it sounds like that's happening really far away, right? And it's because we've cut off the highs and we've cut off the lows and we've added some reverb. And the reverb works because fewer direct sound waves will reach you, and more will have an opportunity to reach you by reflecting off of walls and the ground and other things like that. So reverb will also help make things sound far away. And so this rack, anything in your mix that you want to sit behind everything else that's supposed to be up front in your face, you could just throw this rack on, crank this macro, right? And this knob just, it macros these on-off buttons, but I have these EQ cuts both before and after, because sometimes it sounds better before and sometimes it sounds better after. And so this will let me do before, after, or both. Right, and then the last thing I have is this gain knob, which is mapped to this volume here, and that will just let me correct the gain so I can get it where I want it after adding this rack. And also, when you're making changes, you want them to play at the same volume ideally in order to be able to tell if it's really made something better. So it's always nice to have a gain knob so you can gain compensate. So when you're playing it, right, I could turn this up. And then I could have a comparison that one's not just louder and I don't just think it's better because it's louder. This far away rack is really useful for mixing. I'm going to show you another one that's useful for sound design. The first thing I want to note is I didn't program this rack, right? And I actually don't know all the ins and outs of it because I haven't reverse engineered it, but it's very powerful, and it will be a good example to show you what can be accomplished. I'm going to put a link to this, but this comes from Sidebrain. You can see their website right here. They've got a lot of racks, some really cool ones. I did one on their chord strummer rack, but I had forgotten that I'd gotten it from them, but they made the original chord strummer that I then tricked out, so check the description for links to these guys. Now check this rack. I'm going to leave this far away because I think it sounds cool, but I'm going to add these filters in, and each one's going to sound a little bit different. Actually, I just remembered I made a whole rack with a loop just to be able to play with these for you guys. So obviously endless fun that can be had with these filters here. They do a lot of different things. So you can see when we open up this mapping here, there's so much going on that it actually took a second to load, right? And it's all color coded, so it's really not that hard to reverse engineer if you wanted, right? And you'll see a lot of these device ons from 1 to 127, right? They're just making sure that all this stuff that they don't want on turns off when it's not supposed to be on, right? So you can see certain knobs turning white from gray as I turn these on. And this is all it is. It's just a bunch of these devices, and they've carefully calibrated all these parameters to each macro knob, and each one's controlling like 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 different things, right? And so it would take a lot of work to design some of these sounds, especially to do the layering and the automation of these things, right? You could just show automation, on the backside or whatever, automate these parameters so some are going up, some are going down, and you can do some really, really cool sound design effects with very little effort, right? And it comes from having built these tools in the first place or having acquired them from online like I did in the case of these excellent filters, right? So hopefully the sonic possibilities of these tools, I mean, this is just one example, right? There's like millions of things that you can do, really like limitless things that you can do, and your creativity is really the only limitation that's going on here. And as you craft more of these and you save them, you can have these perform functions that might take you a long time, or it just smooths out the amount of effort and increases the speed at which you can produce. And anytime you can do that, you've become a better producer. Anytime you can get more art done faster and have more options available to you to stylize each individual second of your song, each individual sound, right, and do it quickly and easily, right, you're becoming a better producer. So building these tools is really, really where it's at in Ableton. Like I said, the rack is a fundamental unit of thought in Ableton. You just want racks and racks and racks that you know what they do and that you can use, and then that's going to take your production to the next level. So that's all I have for you guys this time around. Check the rest of this series though. I'm going to show you a bunch of racks that I've built, and I'm going to show you some more details and like special tricks that you can do to program this stuff. There's quite a few cool things that I've developed and that I've seen from others that can increase the number of things that you can do. Just a quick teaser, I've made knobs where you can switch it, and one knob, each click can be a whole different preset of, whether it's audio effects or the way you're affecting MIDI or the chord that's playing. I mean, it really goes on and on and on. And there's just a million other ways to manipulate these things. They're very, very powerful. They're deceptively powerful because, when you open this up, you're just like, oh, it's just changing a bunch of stuff at once. But it's the way you calibrate these things and the way you combine them that can make you do so many interesting things. So I'll put links to these different things, and you can reverse engineer how they work. You can try and build your own. But anything that you do often, maybe build a rack for it, and then you can do it just as often, but it'll take you less time, right? Or something that you have thought about doing once, right? Build a rack that will do it, and then you can do it every time with very little effort. All right. Take care, guys. I hope this was useful. Leave questions in the comments below. Please subscribe to my channel. I've got so much more to teach you. I love doing this. I love improving producer skills so that we can have more wonderful music in this world. So thank you so much, and take care.